Hello, I'm Dr. Ryan Anderson. I'm one of the co-founders of Telos. This webinar is designed to help you learn about parenting styles, in particular the importance of working towards developing an authoritative parenting style, and the connection between that and something that we call the Teflon Demeanor here at Telos, which underlies everything that we do and everything that we'll be trying to help you learn to do as we work to help you learn to be a positive influence for good and growth in your young adult child's life. So let's start with a little bit of understanding and background. So it's important to recognize that we cannot control other people. And when we try to control other people, our efforts can range anywhere from being counterproductive all the way to becoming abusive. So it's very difficult sometimes because we love our children, we feel anxious about them, we want to see good things happen for them. And sometimes when we see them struggling with their decisions, it can be easy to fall into the trap of trying to control them. But it's important that we don't fall into that trap because usually what it costs is far greater than any temporary gain that we get from it. However, it is true that we can and do exert influence on other people. In fact, it's impossible for us to not exert influence on other people. You can never be a truly neutral force in anyone's life that you have any real kind of contact with. And so, as we think about that, we need to recognize that our influence will either make it easier for your young adult child to develop adaptive responses, and so will yours, or your influence and ours can, in fact, make it harder for your young adult child to develop adaptive responses. And one of the things that we need to recognize is that whatever we're doing, the way we're using our influence and the way they're responding to our influence over time, that crystallizes into their way of seeing the world and, in fact, becomes the backbone of their personality. So, for example, if you take a look at the illustration we have on this page, you have a tree here, and by looking at the tree, just in a still picture, you can learn an awful lot about its environment. You can recognize that this is a tree that has been subjected to heavy winds frequently coming from the same direction. And so the way that the tree has grown and developed is an attempt to adapt to those external forces. Now, that's one of the things that we can often see with our students is that some of the ways that they're struggling, we're not saying that these are all due to parenting mistakes, but the ways that they're struggling teach us about both the internal and the external forces that they have experienced and the ways that they are trying to adapt. While we can't control all of those, you do have the ability to control your influence. There are other factors. What you see before you here is something called the ecological system model by Yuri Bronfenbrenner. And you'll notice that in the microsystems that surround the child, there's you, right? The child's family. But there's other things like school, peers, the neighborhood playground, daycare, religious organizations, and so forth. The mesosystem is the interaction between all of these different microsystems and the exosystem, which are extended family members, neighbors, a larger environment in which they live. The macrosystem has to do with the mental and emotional aspects, the attitudes and ideologies of the cultures that they encounter in their lives. And then there's also the chronosystem, the way that things evolve for them over time. All of these are factors. And it's true that we can't eliminate or overpower any of the other ones, but you do need to recognize that you are an incredibly influential factor in your child's life. And while you can't control all of the others, you can and should be very thoughtful and very intentional about how you use the influence that you do have. Which leads us to an examination of parenting styles. There's been a lot of research for many years about parenting styles, and a useful model has been this four-quadrant parent style. Now you'll notice that the four factors that are being examined here are responsiveness, right? How engaged, how involved we are to the child. And demanding this, but people might also talk about this as having expectations of the child. And you'll notice that when both the demandingness or the expectations are low, but our engagement is also low, then our parenting style comes to come across as uninvolved. And whether we actually care or not, we kind of inadvertently send the message that we don't really care. And different signs and symptoms of being an uninvolved parenting style parent are having no expectations or very inconsistent expectations, very few rules and inconsistently applied, tend to be absent a lot, both physically and emotionally, tends to be passive or neglectful, uninterested, not engaging with what the child's interested in, even if it's different than your own interests. And you have all these other competing priorities that are constantly pulling you away. Now, on the other hand, you may have a lot of warmth and a lot of responsiveness, but you still have very low expectations for your child. This tends to be a permissive parenting style. And it tends to come across as whatever you want, but it also sends the inadvertent message to a child that they're actually kind of fragile, that they shouldn't be expected to do things that are hard or difficult, and that you see them as actually kind of incapable. Even if that's not how you feel, these are some of the messages that are sent. So, signs and symptoms of being a permissive parent are having low expectations and constantly trying to lower the bar to their current level of effort. Having few rules, you tend to be indulgent and give in a great deal, even when what they're asking for is not necessarily in their best interest. You are accepting, which is wonderful, but it also means you might accept certain things that are destructive or even abusive coming from your child. You tend to be lenient and not give a lot of guidelines, not really have anything for your child to live up to. And there's oftentimes an avoidance of confrontation. If the child becomes angry, a permissive parent tends to fold. But again, there's a lot of warmth, and that can make it feel like you're being a good parent. And if warmth was the only factor in being a good parent, certainly that would be the case. But children need warmth and guidance and structure and scaffolding to help them grow. Now, where the demandingness is high, right? High expectations, but not very responsive, not very warm, not very validating. What you get is the my way or the highway kind of authoritarian parenting, where when the child asks why, it's because I said so, and that ought to be good enough for you. So there are high expectations, and the rules are clear. And in fact, there may be far too many rules. The rules may, in fact, be too restrictive, and there tends to be a forceful approach towards enforcing those rules when the child has hesitations or push back against them. This tends to be a very autocratic sort of ruling style, and it's rigid. There's no room for flexibility, no room for recognizing that maybe there need to be accommodations. Punishment, consequences are a big part of authoritarian parenting. And often it's not very good at teaching, it's just more making the child suffer discomfort as a way to try to incentivize them not to diverge from the expectations in the future. And again, this tends to be that the warmth is limited and they come across more as an authority figure. Now, the type of parenting that we encourage here, based on science, is authoritative. So this is one where there's a real relationship and a conversation going on between parents and children. Now, there are high expectations. These expectations have been carefully thought through and arrived at based on the capacity of the child and their ability to grow. There are clear standards and they are consistently applied. There's an assertive parent. They don't tend to just fold in the face of opposition, but they are willing to hear about what the child has to say. And when there are opportunities to look at mutually agreeable ways of solving problems while still being true to the guiding principles, there's an openness to that kind of exploration, which leads to flexibility, not infinite flexibility. We don't violate principles, we don't lower standards, but it does mean that we're able to be open to thinking about multiple ways of achieving those standards. There's a responsiveness, an emotional warmth that's present while also having those high expectations, with the understanding that with high expectations come high levels of support. Now, science has shown that there are common outcomes to each of these parenting styles. For permissive parents, we often see children who develop poor emotional regulation, difficulties with self discipline. They tend to be much more impulsive and much more likely to develop unhealthy or destructive habits. They are more prone to a wide variety of forms of delinquency and also much more prone to developing addictions of many kinds. They tend to not perform as well academically, and they also tend to become aggressive because they've learned that being aggressive works for them. It gets the parent to fold, it gets the expectation to go away. Now, in response to authoritarian parenting, we tend to see children who have significant self esteem issues. And they have a tendency to either develop a follower mentality or a rebel mentality because they don't like the degree of control and some of the objectification that goes along with authoritarian parenting. There is a decrease in social skills, partially because their parents are not modeling social skills to them in the way that they're parenting. They tend to have greater difficulty making positive decisions for themselves and spend a lot of time seeking to avoid punishment or win the battle against the parent. There's a general decrease in their happiness and an increase in rates of depression. And there's a tendency to seek external validation, which can lead to a greater vulnerability to forming codependence, as well as a variety of addictions. When there's uninvolved parenting, what we tend to see coming out of children is lower self esteem. The parent often feels like the child, or at least I should say the child feels like the parent doesn't see them as a priority. There's a higher tendency towards delinquency, oftentimes with secondary gain of gaining attention as a result of acting out. There's increases in depression. They're more likely to withdraw socially, to have social anxiety, to be constantly worried about their self worth and their lovability. There tends to be an increase in inappropriate behaviors of all kinds, a decrease in motivation because it feels like no matter how hard they try, they just won't be important enough. As a result, there tends to be lower academic performance and also increased tendency for substance use. Now, when we see people using authoritative parenting, the outcomes are much more positive. There's a decrease in mental illness symptoms across the board. The child is happier and tends to develop more self reliance and more adaptability and more emotional resilience. They have higher levels of self esteem. They're less vulnerable to negative peer influences and peer pressure. They have better social skills and they're more likely to be academically successful. So, both for the child's sake and also for our effectiveness in helping them grow, there's every reason to aim for being a consistent, authoritative parent versus the other three parenting styles. Now, it's easy enough to say, hey, work on being an authoritative parent. But there are reasons that you have developed the parenting styles that you have. So I want you to take a few minutes to consider the following. In fact, even write down the answers you come up with and discuss these with your therapist. Which parenting style is predominant for you now? If you take a look over the last 6 weeks, 12 weeks, 6 months, which of these parenting styles best describes you? Which parenting style has been predominant for you throughout your child's formative years? So while they were young, while they were developing all of those basic concepts of themselves, where were you in your parenting? What did they experience from you in that time? How did you come to develop your parenting? Was it something intentional? Were there specific things you were doing? Was it actively mirroring what your parents had done? Was it a rebellion against what your parents had done? Or was it simply one of those things where you find yourselves internalizing things that you received and just sort of automatically putting them out as a result? how does your child usually respond to your parenting? Do we see those increases in self-esteem, self-worth, adaptability, problem solving? Or do we find them shutting down, rebelling, withdrawing? And how do you typically respond to your child's response to your parenting? There's a feedback loop going on there. And it's quite possible that, especially as your child has gotten stuck and struggled, that there may be sort of a stuckness in that system as well, in that feedback loop. There may have developed some circular causation there. And if there is, then as we help you learn to alter your aspects of that interaction, that can be a powerful influence to help your child learn to alter their aspects of that circular feedback loop going on. Now, as I say this, we recognize that there are deep roots in all of us about how we have developed our parenting style. It may be our childhood experiences, personal mental health symptoms like our own anxiety and depression and OCD. Those can easily be the ones steering the ship in our parenting. There can be harmony or strain in the co-parenting relationship, and that can lead to our parenting style. And most of the time, just from what research has shown, when we think we're compensating for the other parent and what we see as their lack of parenting skills, what we're often doing is overcompensating and creating a seesaw effect, both on the outsides, oftentimes authoritarian and permissive, or uninvolved and permissive. And none of those are having the kind of influence that we'd like to have on your child. There's personal learned behaviors or your personal style of emotional coping that are a part of what has formed your parenting. There's the stress and the strain and the competing priorities you have in your life. There may be trauma and other things. So when we talk about altering parenting styles or enhancing parenting styles, we need to recognize that we need to be willing to look at, examine, and work on these things under the surface in order to make progress on the things on the surface as well. Now, combined with all of this is an approach at Telos that we call the Teflon Demeanor. The idea is that in your parenting, your child is often going to communicate their struggles in ways that are ineffective and indirect, and oftentimes ways that feel attacking and insulting. Utilizing a Teflon demeanor allows us to guide the children and make our parenting and our influence about them and not about us. So Teflon, of course, is a material that was developed that we often put on pans or things like that. And the whole idea behind Teflon is that nothing sticks to it, that you can cook eggs on it and they won't burn on and stick, and that's the value of it. So our Teflon demeanor means that no matter what the child is throwing at us in their emotional distress, we're not letting it stick. And we're not turning our conversation into the stuff that's sticking for us, the buttons that are being pushed in us. So the Teflon demeanor recognizes that a wide range of maladaptive behaviors on the part of your child, including disrespectful ones, are communicating their internal struggle to us. And when we use the Teflon demeanor, we are focusing on the problem they are having rather than making the focus of our intervention on the problem they are giving. That doesn't mean that we don't redirect and correct maladaptive or disrespectful behaviors, but it does have a big influence on how we do it. And once we've been able to resolve the struggle that they're having on the inside, they tend to be much more open to examining and changing and repairing the problematic attitudes and behaviors. Whereas if you just try to target the problematic attitudes and behaviors, they tend to double down on them and entrench themselves in them. So you'll notice later on there's another webinar that you'll get with training on something called the relationship continuum, and you'll revisit this many times at Telos. But you'll notice down here in the bottom right, it says in all situations, whether they're in the green, the yellow, or the red, You must maintain a Telos way of being, which is the getting out of the box stuff we talked about in those webinars, and the Teflon demeanor. It's always going to be a part of what we're doing. So let's give an example. Let's say we have a student here at Telos and they're being very demanding, insulting, and disrespectful. Maybe they're wanting the staff to drop what they're doing immediately to go and pick up a money order for them for something that they're anxious to get. So as the student is doing that, there's a couple things we would instruct our staff and train our staff not to do, and that we would encourage you as a parent not to do. You'll notice how these fall into those different parenting styles. So we encourage them not to just let it happen and let them be disrespectful and let them get what they want that way and hope that they'll stop being disrespectful as a result. We would encourage them not to just give in to them, give them what they want. We would encourage them not to have a passive aggressive approach, saying, well, I really wish you would show me a little more respect. And we'd encourage them not to have an aggressive approach. Look, you need to show me some respect right now, young man or young woman. What you're doing right now is completely unacceptable. Those are all things we would actually steer you and them away from. So what could a Teflon demeanor response look like? Well, here's one example. It's not the only way to do it, but I want you to notice the different elements. So it starts off with recognizing the emotion they're having. We're talking about what I'm observing. I notice that you seem to be feeling pretty agitated right now, very anxious about this money order. And then there's an observation of the external behavior. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but you are coming across as pretty aggressive and disrespectful. And we talk about, okay, this puts me in an awkward situation, right? This is a difficult situation. I'm not willing to just go along with this the way it is. I want to help you with how you're feeling and what you need, but I want to make sure we go about it in a healthy way. And so then we make a request. Can we slow this down and talk about what's going on with you right now? Because I want to help you with this right now, but I think I need to understand more about what's going on for you. So we're trying to learn more, but we're also trying to help them be a little more self aware. Okay, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I doing? How am I coming across right now? And there's a recognition that they might not be able to have that conversation just yet. So you might put something out there like, well, do you feel like we can talk about that now? Or would it be helpful to take an RNP first to clear your head and then try to talk about it? RNP stands for reflect and process. It's our ability to take a step back, work on some self-care, and then re-engage with positive problem solving. So you'll notice we're not just letting it slide, but we're slowing it down. We're not letting it be about us and the way we might be feeling disrespected. We're turning it back onto them and the struggle they're having and how we can help them work through that struggle. So notice what is missing. We don't take the bait. We don't get offended. We don't go, wow, they're calling me some pretty nasty things, or they're being really disrespectful of my time. Notice that we're not expressing feelings of being offended because that's not what this is about. And telling them that we're offended doesn't do anything to resolve the struggle that they're having. You notice that there's not scolding or punishing involved. There's not permissiveness. We're not just letting it happen. And also, there's not a lack of an action plan. We're talking about, okay, let's do something to resolve this. Let's give this some place to go. That's going to be more positive. So when we think about problem solving with a Teflon demeanor, there are typically a couple of steps that are a part of it. One, you've got to avoid making it about us and taking the bait. And of course, everything we talk about, your must be seen as box, your I deserve box, all those different parts of emotional regulation go into successfully completing step one. Step two is focusing on the problem they are having, not the problem they are giving. And that may mean helping them slow things down and observe what's happening with them that's leading to this kind of an approach. Step three is helping them find some kind of resolution for their dilemma. So we're not going to get far in helping them examine their behavior until they're at least feeling validated, understood, or having something that's helping bring down the intensity of the emotion that they're feeling. And after we've done that, then step 4 is circling back and helping them think about how they were behaving, the impact that was having on other people, and exploring what they need to do to repair whatever damage was done through their behavior and their attitudes. So we do get there, but that's not where we start. And when we go this route to get there, we are often far more effective in having them listen and respond with emotional openness to that kind of correction and redirection and learning of new behaviors. So there's a lot of pieces to think about that. Again, time for action, time to go back and talk to your therapist about those answers to those questions that we had previously, and to explore what we can do to help you grow in your effectiveness with authoritative parenting and the Teflon Demeanor.